My name is Dan DeWitz, and I'm going to be presenting Feeding New York, the Hidden Burden on the South Bronx. So, a bit about me and why I'm interested in this project. I grew up on a farm in Minnesota. We raised pigs or hogs. We grew corn and soybeans. I also went to grad school in the Hudson Valley. I studied economics at the Levy Institute at Bard College. There, I had the opportunity to meet some farmers. I worked one summer at Tivoli Mushrooms, which is a culinary mushroom farm in the Hudson Valley. And I'm also a data scientist, and now I live in Southern Manhattan. I've been here for about 3, 4 years now. And as a data scientist, I'm a huge proponent of open data. I think it's really important. And so I guess my goal here was to kind of fuse these different experiences and interests and hopefully contribute in some way. That being said, there's a lot I don't know. And the more I've gotten into this project, the more I realized the less I know. So in some instances, I am painting with some broad strokes and might be missing some important nuance. And I'm definitely happy to hear about that as we go. So what the plan is, So what I've focused on or landed on is three main topics for this talk. First, I want to just talk about the national landscape of the US food system. Secondly, diving into Hunts Point specifically. And then lastly, looking at policy initiatives, mostly surrounding Hunts Point. After each point or after each kind of topic, I'll open it up to group discussion. Feel free to hit the chat at any time, but just know that there will be an opportunity to come off mic and talk. Yeah, heads up about that. Okay, so jumping into this, just to make sure we're all on the same page, monopoly. Most people probably know what this is, but it's the exclusive possession or control of the supply or trade of a commodity. So that's monopoly. All right, oligopoly. What is oligopoly? It's very similar to monopoly, but instead of one company, there's a few firms that control a large portion of the market. Generally, a lot of economists talk about the CR4, which is a measure of how much concentration there are in the top 4 corporations in a specific market. When this threshold approaches 40%, that's when abuse is likely. And what do we mean by abuse? There's kind of 5 core levers of influence. So higher prices and artificial scarcity is just when firms control a large portion of the market. They have price setting power and the ability to basically restrict supply on demand to lock in higher prices. Threat of collusion with 4 firms controlling a large portion of the market. It's pretty easy to coordinate actions, and you don't even need to do this explicitly. You can just go on the news or post on Twitter your evaluation of current market conditions and what you plan to do. Third, large companies have big budgets to invest in R&D, and they do this at times, but they can also just buy up and coming companies, stifling innovation or killing competition. Generally, the bigger companies get, the more worker conditions diminish. So when there is a high concentration of firms regionally working in a specific sector, there can be limited opportunities to leave a company and work in a similar sector at another company. So basically, in this case, it's only one employer. A classic example of this is Walmart and Amazon, notoriously poor wages. And then lastly is regulatory capture, which just means large firms have the ability to make campaign contributions, to lobby, or kind of the revolving door from board member to special committee appointee. So that's oligopoly. And so what we see in the food sector is it's very heavily dominated by oligopoly. Almost every sector of the food supply chain has this feature. Here is just highlighting a few of them. this reference line is the 40%. So that's when we see abuses are likely. We can see in cottonseed, beef processing, corn seeds, etc., a very high rate of concentration among the top 4 companies in each industry. So diving into a few specifically, this is poultry, pork, and beef. And then, so these are the 4 main companies. So just being explicit there. What I think is interesting is these brands, they don't sell their products in the grocery store under that main company name. They have a bunch of subsidiary brands for different price points, different branding, marketing, targeting different consumers, etc. So this one I thought was striking as someone who loves coffee. This company, JAB Holding, they control 20% of the global coffee trade. I genuinely thought these were independent brands, but they're all owned by JAB. I definitely thought Stumptown was a local roaster, but no, they're part of this major transnational corporation. And so retail grocery is also highly concentrated. I think groceries are interesting both because I love going to the grocery store, but also it's where we interact directly with the food market. And so the biggest grocer is Walmart, followed by Kroger, Costco, Albertsons. Interestingly, in New York City, we don't have really any of these grocers don't have a presence. Walmart doesn't have any stores. And I don't think Kroger or Albertsons does either. Costco has a few locations. And I guess Walmart, you can actually get Walmart groceries delivered now through Instant, but no physical store within city limits. But doing this research, one fact that I was astounded by is that 90% of Americans live within a 10-minute drive of a Walmart. So if you've lived outside of New York City for any amount of time, you might not be too surprised by this stat. And the other thing that I was really surprised by is that, so why did Walmart get into groceries? And especially given that the price margins or the markup on groceries is really small, it's about 3 to 4%. And so the reason why Walmart wanted to get into groceries is because you need to go and get groceries every week or multiple times a week. So that gets you in their store. And if you get into their Walmart store, you're more likely to buy something else, a higher markup retail good, and retail goods are marked up generally about 20%. So Walmart got into groceries just to get you in the door to sell you other stuff. All right, so we didn't always have this extreme concentration of firms in the food sector. So just a very brief history is following the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, price instability following World War II, there were more effective antitrust laws in place. Antitrust laws just meaning laws that restrict the power of monopoly or oligopoly. One essential piece of this legislation was paying farmers to leave portions of their land unplanted or paying them to plant crops that maintain or replenish soil quality. Here I'm focusing on Cargill, but other major firms do this as well. Specifically Cargill, a grain distributor, they really didn't like this limit on how much crops you can grow. And generally an essential turning point in legislation is often pointed to the Reagan administration, an appeal to free market solutions. And over time, this kind of weakened antitrust laws, the original Farm Bill, and production limits were lifted and farmers were encouraged to plant fence row to fence row. And also importantly, crops for export like corn and soy were incentivized. Farmers were incentivized to grow those crops. So here is a quote from the leader of the National Farmers Union. Agricultural policy does not protect the person you or I think of as a farmer. It benefits the largest operations and processors, and the processors want cheap grain. So how does this affect us, our diets, our health? Basically, we see the prices for processed foods, which typically include corn syrup, a product now with all of this kind of surplus corn. Those dropped in prices. Meanwhile, the price of fresh fruits and vegetables increased. And then over the same time period from the Reagan administration to recent 2008, we see obesity rates more than double in both adults and children. So the point being there is just that food policy oligopoly does affect what we eat and our health. And we are talking about transportation today. So just how do we get most of our food? 70% by truck. Rail does have a significant presence. And also maritime is meaningful as well. Some other things that I've maybe left out of this story is there has been major changes in farm technology, bigger tractors, combines, seed genetics, allowing for Roundup ready corn, for example. Basically, it took a lot less people to farm the same amount of land. This led a lot of people to leave rural areas and move into cities or into the suburbs. And then at the same time, we see things like the National Highway Bill, but in general, the US pivoting pretty hard towards car-centric design. And just note, this wasn't always the case. There was a time when almost every major city had some form of light rail. For instance, in the 1920s, Los Angeles actually had the largest light rail system in the world. We also see our food coming from further away. So here, just highlighting that some of the core imports from Mexico and then bananas from Guatemala. California is also a huge producer of fresh produce. I believe we import roughly 35% of our produce, and then the next biggest share is from California and then Florida. And so this is oligopoly is really the opposite of what we see in New York City, where in New York City, 98 to 99% of all firms typically employ under 100 people. Nonetheless, just noting that we do have big corporate presence in the grocery store scene. Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, Trader Joe's, and Target. Okay, so a lot of this research, a lot of what I just presented is from this book called Barron's Money, Power, and the Corruption of Americans' Food Industry. So I guess the first discussion question I'm proposing is, do we think the national structure of the food industry is corrupt? There is some instances of explicit corruption, but things like lobbying, donating to campaigns, mergers and acquisitions, leverage buyouts, these aren't illegal. Perhaps they're just good business strategy. And then, do we think NYC has good produce? If anyone wants to share their thoughts on that, feel free to do. I'm just going to check the chat, but if anyone wants to come off mic and either ask a question or respond with something else completely unrelated, that's fine as well.
Yeah, Dan, I do see a question in chat from Jonathan. I'm not sure if Jonathan wants to come off mute and say it. If not, I can just go ahead and read it aloud. But Jonathan asked, do you know offhand who the largest retail grocer in New York City is? And there's actually a nice discussion underneath that question in the chat as well.
I do not. I did briefly look into this. It was confusing, but was there an answer provided? Key Foods or Aldi? Might be Key Foods. I don't think it is actually Whole Foods.
If it is Key Food or maybe Aldi, if anybody happens to know, or if you happen to know, Dan, if that grocer is like a subsidiary of one of these companies, like you were alluding to with the other examples of Tyson Foods owning something like Jimmy Dean sausages or whatever.
So I do know that out of the big four grocers, Walmart, Kroger, Albertson, that none of them have this is what I believe I read, is none of them have a subsidiary store in New York City. And so I do think the biggest grocer is somebody regional. There wasn't super great data on this. So that is definitely something I'll follow up on.
Hi, can I come off mic for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Leela, and I also don't know the answer to this. I chimed in a little bit in the chat. I did a little bit of looking into this for a presentation at one point. I think a lot of people are familiar with the independent grocery banners. There's a bunch under Key Food, there's a bunch under Crasdale, Associated Allegiance. And my very general understanding is that they all depend on these large centralized distributors like UNFI, CNS, KeyHe, if I'm pronouncing that, Federated. And it seems like over the years, sometimes those contracts shift back and forth where one of them might move from one to the other. But the whole thing seems like it is really based on those large distributors, going back to the point about centralization.
Awesome. Thank you for that context. Yeah. Here I didn't touch about the distribution aspect. There is also an oligopoly amongst distributors. I think Cisco is the biggest one nationally. The next section we're going to talk about Hunts Point specifically, and so we'll get into that a little bit more. But if anyone else has something to say on this topic, feel free to come off mic now. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Going once, twice. Okay. All right. Smash cut to Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. I really can't tell this story better than this website here, created by Anthony. But okay, for those of you who may not be aware, Hunts Point is a low-lying peninsula in the East River. That's this entire landmass is Hunts Point. So food comes here from 55 different countries, 49 different states. And here is the food distribution center. Here's the residential core, and then the rest is industrial area. I did want to mention, so who does Hunts Point serve? So 49% of the customers are independent restaurants and cafes, 20% are bodegas, 18% are supermarkets, 13% are food markets. So it is mostly serving small businesses, bodegas, I believe smaller supermarkets like Mr. Kiwi, for example, or kind of those smaller neighborhood grocery stores. But Whole Foods has their own distribution center. Key Foods is most likely plugged into another form of food distribution from these national suppliers. So yeah, I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind. Hunts Point is also a cooperative, so it's owned by a bunch of different members. I think it's okay to generalize and say it's publicly owned, or at least it's operated in tandem with the city. So it is like this crucial link for restaurants, bodegas to get produce, wholesale produce, places that can't really negotiate with these major companies, or there's just barriers there in general. And so the residential core here, 13,000 people live here. And so just some demographics on who are those people. It's mostly Latino. It's the poorest neighborhood in the city, or has the highest rate of poverty, I should say. And yeah, there's about 13,000 residents. Speaking of bodegas, one ratio that we'll talk about a little bit later is the bodega to grocery store divide. And so Hunts Point, like a lot of low-income neighborhoods, has mostly bodegas and not too many actual grocery stores. But the main topic of discussion with Hunts Point is the environmental damage or pollution from basically all of these trucks coming to the food distribution network. And so yeah, just showing like the neighborhood is surrounded by trucking routes and then the Buckner Expressway. And We also see here that these are schools. And so we see the schools actually on the edge of the resident are exposed to pollution. And okay, so I think that's the core points. And so now I'm jumping into my custom analysis using NYC Open Data. So here I'm using the air quality data. There's a bunch of different tools to visualize this data. I found it a little bit confusing. At one point I was trying to like actually inventory them all and make sure I'm doing something novel, but I ended up just creating exactly what I wanted to see. And so some of this might be redundant, but that's what my goal was. So this is showing ozone. Ozone is when sunlight reacts with industrial emissions. It creates this pollutant. The blue line is Hunts Point and Mont Haven, and the dash is citywide. And so the goal here is just to show, and these gray lines are every other neighborhood. And so for ozone, we can see Hunts Point is below the city-wide average. But then, interestingly, who has the most ozone pollution? It's the Rockaways or people by the ocean. So fine particles, this pollutant is most related to burning diesel fuel, so fine particulate matter. And so one thing about Hunts Point, I believe, or the food distribution centers, it's really specializes in cold chain logistics. There's the meat market there, the fish market there, which definitely they need to remain cold chain compliant from source to store. Produce, there's similar regulations. And so Hunts Point, it doesn't have enough cold storage currently. So what ends up happening is a bunch of trucks, they need a bunch of refrigerated trucks, often at all times, are sitting and idling, which beyond just transporting the food there is another major contributor of pollution, and specifically this fine particulate matter. Here we see Hunts Point is above the city average, but perhaps not an outlier. And we see the top neighborhoods in this metric are Chelsea, Greenwich, Union Square, etc. So neighborhoods that just have a lot of traffic. And so is Hunts Point meaningfully different? And so as a data scientist, this is just one question that I'm always asking is, okay, we see that Hunts Point is above the median. We also see the distribution of this metric of all of the other neighborhoods. And so what I'm just kind of ask is, is it meaningfully higher than the median or the average? And so one simple way to do that is a box plot. And each dot here represents a neighborhood. This line is the median value. So most people are familiar with average. The problem with average is it's influenced by outliers. The median literally just ranks each neighborhood from lowest to highest and then picks the one out of the middle and says that's the median. And so this upper bound is 75%. So basically 50% of neighborhoods will fall within this box from 25% to 75%. And this is just a simple way to say, okay, anything above the 75% is perhaps meaningfully higher. Something I didn't look into is like another way to think about this too is just, what does scientific research say about when this level of particulate matter becomes unsafe? But so here, even though we see it is higher, it might not look like an insane outlier. It is above average. And then the last one is nitro dioxide, which is a direct result from just traffic combustion. We see the same thing above the median, not a crazy outlier. Here, Hunts Point is within the interquartile range, so perhaps it's really not that elevated relative to the other neighborhoods. On the contrary, though, when we start to look at health outcomes, we do see Hunts Point now does become an outlier. So here we're looking at asthma emergency department visits due to PM 2.5. This is available in the open data. I didn't research too deeply into the sources, really just started visualizing it. But here we see Hunts Point is an outlier. The top neighborhood is East Harlem. We see the same thing. This is for children. This is for adults. We see the same pattern. And then when we look at asthma emergency department visits due to ozone, we also see Hunts Point is an outlier. And then asthma hospitalizations, again, Hunts Point is drastically higher than the mean, and in this case, every other neighborhood. Deaths look a little bit different, but the main thing, and then again, Hunts Point is an outlier for cardiovascular and respiratory hospitalizations. So nearly every metric when it comes to health, Hunts Point is an outlier. Annual vehicles traveled, this was provided in the open data. So it was something I was just curious if Hunts Point would jump out at that raw metric of having way more miles traveled in it. Doesn't really appear so here. But the thing is, this data, Hunts Point and Mott Haven, are consolidated together. And if I adjust it and just say, let's just say half of those truck miles are in Hunts Point, a neighborhood that literally sees 15,000 truck visits a day. So over the course of a day, literally more than one truck per resident. Then we can see actually, even though this is like a rough estimate, Hunts Point is quite different in terms of vehicles, miles traveled. And so what I really wanted to get to though is, although we don't see much correlation between the poverty rate and then exposure to pollutants, we do see this extremely strong correlation between poverty rate and health outcomes. I think this is quite striking. You usually don't see relationships like this obvious. And then the last thing I looked at was the poverty versus food access, so bodega to supermarket access. There is a relationship here. It's not as strong. Bodega to supermarket ratio, I think it is like an intuitive metric, a little bit more intuitive than say like grocery retail space per person, but it's still a little bit flawed. If you just don't have a lot of bodegas or grocery stores, this could still look relatively good. We see it actually highest amongst Bed-Stuy, and we do see relatively wealthy neighborhoods having a lower bodega to supermarket ratio. Yeah, so with all of that, I was basically setting up this question, which is, so Karen Karp, she did an episode on the Odd Lots podcast, and she said, we don't really use the term food desert anymore because the food is there. The problem is income and the ability to purchase quality food. And so are the Hunts Point outcomes, do we think they're more associated directly to pollution? Or are they associated more with income? Something that I didn't have the opportunity to visualize, but I assume is true, is that income also is strongly correlated with access to healthcare. And then another thing that we don't have data on is just the compounding influence of being low income or financially strained and stress. And so that's just one thing I've been thinking about. And then the other one is just, are the sensors actually in the right spots to accurately reflect pollution in the residential core of Hunts Point? So those are a few questions. If anyone wants to provide their opinion, or if you feel like I left anything important kind of out of this story thus far, I would be happy to hear that as well.
I am curious to know if anybody can speak to how prices and availability of fresh food in the nearby neighborhoods compare to other parts of New York City, and if the impact of that has any bearing in this sort of data at all.
So the neighborhood's next to the Hunts Point Food Market.
Yeah, like the residential area, the kind of broader areas, and billing out from there.
So I'll give my take and then happy to hear from anyone that knows more than me. My understanding is that Hunts Point is a wholesale distributor. So as far as being an individual person, you can go there, but you have to pay a car fee and then you have to buy in bulk. And so given that's one element, the other element is, I'm not sure if you're going to Hunts Point, if you're a bodega and you need to source food from Hunts Point, if proximity really matters outside of just making that trip a little bit easier. But that's two things I've been thinking about. But honestly, I don't really know. And that is an interesting question for sure.
My name's Gitas. Thank you for this great presentation, Dan. I like to see the statistical work. I live adjacent to Hunts Point, very close. And I can tell you that it is a food desert. I don't care what a consultant wants to say a term is no longer appropriate, but it's not a matter of income. I have to bike. I bike a lot, so I can bike to Whole Foods in Harlem, or I can bike to Fairway, or go to other places to get quality, fresh fruit and vegetables. I've scoured every supermarket nearby me, and they do their best, but it's usually not great. The meats are terrible. And I know this is true for a broad area. So I'm not just speaking anecdotally, but I just did want to address it in those terms.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
I did have a question, though, that I put in the chat about how I saw the data was Hunts Point / Mott Haven. Mott Haven is a big area, so that's sort of, I was wondering if it was any more granularity. There's a question about the air quality sensors, but if you're lumping the ones in that neighborhood with the ones out on 180th Street and 3rd Avenue, like that's gonna dilute any interpretation.
Yes. So one thing is that analyzing the open data at the neighborhood level is a bit tedious because there's a few different methodologies for denoting different neighborhoods. And so it can be tough to align different data to different neighborhoods. So that's one thing that's happening. That's why I made that one plot where I was like, okay, we're just going to assume half of this traffic is actually in Huntsville and see what that does. As far as the air sensors go, I thought I did see once there was a map of air sensors, and I believe there was only one air sensor, and it was like literally in the middle of the food market.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm also curious to know if there is data saying what percentage of food that passes through Hunts Point actually stays in the Bronx. And maybe this is more specific to like how the market acts as a distributor for all these, but if that was something, I know that's not directly on the point of the data that you've been analyzing in terms of the environmental impacts, but if there is data like that exists, if anybody can point me to that.
I did see some data on the ratio between how much of that food is distributed in the city and how much versus the metro, the surrounding metro. And I thought it was like 50-50-ish. So yeah, again, I'm not, there's something, but I don't know specifically. I didn't see anything specifically on how much of it stays in the Bronx.
Is there somewhere that I can look to try to parse out that data myself, or?
Unfortunately, Google, sorry.
That's okay. That's all right.
So the last part is there are several policy initiatives, I believe, coming online later this year, roughly $400 million towards a redevelopment to basically make the food distribution center all electric. So this would replace the need for trucks idling, cold storage trucks just passively idling basically all the time. So that's a pretty big deal. Hunts Point, it's a low-lying peninsula. I guess during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, just narrowly missed a catastrophe because the storm surge hit at low tide. If it would have been high tide, it would have potentially been catastrophic. And there is also some of that money has been tagged to redesign the rail terminal. So I guess currently there's conflict between the organization of trucks have to sometimes wait for trains and trains have to wait for trucks, but it is a very small percentage of food arriving by rail. What I found was roughly 150 cars a month. I think a really exciting part of this process or of this policy is the Blue Highways program. As far as I understand it, is the Brooklyn Navy Yard is a deep water port, so you can receive large barges there, and then from there, that food can go on to other boats and be taken to Hunts Point, Lower Manhattan, and then there's another part of this initiative that is also last mile distribution via electric bicycles. So I think this kind of, for me, hits like the key points of actually reducing the number of trucks on the road and really creative distribution methodologies. And yeah, I love to see electric bikes being utilized in that capacity. Okay, so another book I read recently is this book, Extraction by Theo Riofrancos, which is basically the entire story of lithium and this paradox of the green revolution, essentially requiring a ton of new mines and new mining activity. And the core finding here is that replacing every gas car with an electric car doesn't really move the needle much in terms of climate change. The other thing is electrification, if we frame this in the terms of Hunts Point, it does have a lot of value of reducing emissions in a residential area, in a residential core, but there are no black holes. So those pollutants still exist in the world. They just are in areas that are less populated. The source of electric creation, which could be burning oil, natural gas, coal, etc. And so basically what her modeling found is that to really transform how we use energy is we need to reduce private car usage by 40%. And if we do that, that will drop the demand for new mines or mining lithium by 66%. That was the average, but in the last time period, 2050, that reduction would actually be 92%. So by 2050, redesigning kind of our cities, the way we transport goods, really has a profound impact. As far as food transportation, there are some reasons to think rail is a good idea. It is actually way more energy efficient. It pollutes a lot less. It can haul a lot more goods at once. And it's cheaper, significantly cheaper as well. So I guess that is what motivated me to make this map. I was just curious about was just oh, hey, Metro North actually goes deeper into farm country than you might realize. And it's actually a really great regional transit system that really no other city in the US has. And then I just wanted to see how many farms are around metro transit lines. And so New York State actually has a self-report farm registry, so you can get a better idea of kind of where the farms actually are. Here, they're actually color coordinated based on if they're livestock. Green is produce, purple is vineyards. And then for the surrounding states, I had to just scrape data from a pick your own website. So this only is representing who knows what percentage, but not all farms in the surrounding area. I'm not exactly sure. And then here I highlighted neighborhoods that are above the 75% threshold for having an undesirable grocery store to bodega threshold. This is one of the first things I did, and sometimes you just gotta look at what's possible, to know what you want to do or where you're going. And I don't know, that's the spirit of this. So yeah, I thought it was interesting nonetheless, as far as like actually transporting local food on existing Metro Transit rail infrastructure. I'm sure that's like a whole nother world. But, and the other thing is that I thought was interesting too is that local food is one definition of local is a day's drive, and just what exists within a day's drive, or if we're to think about a day train ride. Yeah, so that's that. Yeah, okay. I put this in my intro or in my talk description, so I'm going to ask it here. I don't know if it's controversial or not, but is relocating Hunts Point wholesale food market, is it inevitable? Why might it be inevitable? Seemingly, I would say we see a lot more 100-year floods. It's in a low-lying peninsula, so that seems like an issue. The other is just geographical constraints about how much food it can actually receive via rail. If we're to use extraction, the thresholds from the book Extraction, then we might want to see, ideally, our wholesale food market receive roughly 40% of the food by rail or 50% by rail. So those are two reasons why I'm leaning a little bit more towards like it is inevitable, say if we're to think 100 years into the future, but also I don't really know. But so yeah, that's all I have for this talk. So yeah, definitely interested to hear if anyone has any thoughts on that question or just any other questions or comments to wrap up here. And if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn or feel free to email me as well.